Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you haven't been here before, my name is Lena Norms and I usually make videos about social change and books. Now today is no different, but also today is completely different. Perhaps this resonates personally, but I think we can all agree, en masse, things are quite stressful right now. Lena's trying to read up on climate change and make a positive series about it. She's also trying to deal with the fact that her last video might not have been seen by you because it was hidden by YouTube for some strange, potentially prejudiced reason. If this video doesn't look recognisable to you, you can watch that here. There's a general pressure to know more and more, but there's also less and less time to just be present, which is a barrier for me to reading, especially when those books aren't new, especially when those books aren't current. Notice I didn't say relevant. A lot of things are relevant without being current. And one of the things that I remembered is very relevant to my life and always has been is a classic called A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. It's a short essay and I'm very passionate about it. The golden oldies among you might remember that I used to do a series on my channel called Bathtub Busking. It took off in a weird way. People started joining the bathtub busking movement and it led to this. But I have just had an urge recently to read aloud and weirdly, this felt less weird to read it to a camera than it did all alone in my flat. So I thought we'd snuggle up with some moody things. I put on my moody lipstick. We're going to be in a mood right now and who better to be in a mood with than Virginia Woolf. Oh my god, ASMR. Did you get tingly? I know nothing about ASMR. I'm somebody who's read to a lot as a child. I find it very comforting. An embarrassing fact about me is that my mum read me out aloud the entire Harry Potter series. Now I am 29 years old, so you can do the maths about how old I was when she read me the last one. But we've always been read aloud to, and it's well, that's on the internet now. I think it's a really sweet way of connecting with people. It makes me sad a lot of the time that reading time and people time can conflict and sometimes you have to choose between them, but I don't think you should. So I want to read to you the beginning of my favourite Virginia Woolf essay. That's it, that's the whole thing. So I've been learning a little bit more about Virginia Woolf recently. I got to interview the director of Vita and Virginia, which is a new film about Vita and Virginia. Vita Sackville-West was a very intelligent, saucy author and they had a love affair together and it was a really interesting story. I also read this little illustrated biography of her life that's really beautiful. I learnt lots about her life. She's it's come from some privilege, man. But the most interesting parts of this is all the hardships she had from like writing and the fact that she really wasn't very successful for a large part of her life. And she always wondered why all these other people were more successful than her and what she was doing wrong, and she seemed incredibly insecure about that at points in her life. I also learned from this podcast that she didn't own a mirror until she had until she was in love with Vita, and Vita took her on a weekend trip and Virginia spontaneously like bought her own mirror for the first time ever because she hated looking at herself, which I thought was really interesting. She gave this, so A Room of One's Own is based, I think it was like a 2-part lecture given at some of the first women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, and the kind of point of the essay, which we might not get to today because I just want to read like the first little bit. I like it because it's just very lovely, stylistic, washes over you, makes you feel connected to something deeper kind of writing. But the point of the essay, if you get to the end, is about how the mind is androgynous and the strange way that people ask questions. Look at my little light jingling about. Just want to shed some light on the situation and the strange questions people ask of women and why they want to read and write. It's really beautiful, so I recommend it. Anyway, that's what I'm going to read to you today. I hope you enjoy. I am addicted to sighing series on this channel, so I think I'm going to call this series Bedtime Book Busking, to echo my bathtub busking days, and also because at the end of the video I'll be putting out my hat, so if you liked it you can stay tuned and see where the busking element comes in. But I think busking should extend to other beneficial artistic practices, not just singing Wonderwall on a ukulele. So here's some busking for you. You can imagine perhaps you've walked past me in a candlelit tunnel on a late night walk back from an incredible theatre show, and you're huddled in a big coat and you hear me reading Virginia Woolf, and I invite you to stop on one of the many cushions I have around my reading blanket. What's happening? If you hear bumping in the background, it's not the heffalumps and wuzzles. Nobody's coming to get me. It's just that my neighbours have heavy feet and I imagine heavy hearts. So I've never pointed out to them the fact that they literally shake my flat every time they move around, because I assume that it comes from a place of either frustration or sadness. We don't want to disturb them. So just enjoy the thuds from above and think of it as part of the collective experience of sadness that we're all going through. Anyway, historical feminism. Virginia Woolf gave this essay as a lecture. She was asked to write about women and fiction, and this is what she gave them. Kind of instead. A room of one's own. But, you may say, we asked you to speak about women and fiction. What has this got to do with a room of one's own? I'll try to explain. When you asked me to speak about women and fiction, I sat down on the banks of a river and I began to wonder what the words meant. They might mean just simply a few remarks about Fanny Burney, a few more about Jane Austen, a tribute to the Brontes and a sketch of Hawthorne's parsonage under snow, some witticisms about possible Miss Mitford, a respectful allusion to George Eliot, a reference to Miss Gaskell, and one would have done. But on second sight, the words seemed not so simple. The title of Women and Fiction might mean, and you may have meant it to mean, women and what they like. Or it might mean women and the fiction that they write. Or it might mean women and the fiction that is written about them. Or it might mean that somehow all three are inextricably mixed together and you wanted me to consider them all in that light. When I began to consider the subject in this way, which seemed to be most interesting, I soon saw that it had one fatal drawback. I should never be able to come to a conclusion. I should never be able to fulfil what is, I understand, the first duty of a lecturer. To hand you, after an hour's discourse, a nugget of pure truth to wrap up between the pages of your notebook and keep on the mantelpiece forever. All I could do was to offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And that, you will see, leaves the great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unsolved. I have shirked the duty of coming to a conclusion on both of these two questions. Women and fiction remain, so far as I'm concerned, unsolved problems. But in order to make some amends, I'm going to do what I can to show you how I arrived at this opinion about the room and the money. I'm going to develop in your presence as fully and freely as I can the train of thought which led me to think this. And perhaps, if I lay bare my ideas, the prejudices that lie beneath the statement, you will find that they have some bearing upon women and some upon fiction. At any rate, when a subject is highly controversial, and any question about sex is that, one can hope to tell the truth. One can only hope to show how one can come to hold whatever opinion one does hold. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. Fiction here is likely to contain more truth than fact. Therefore, I propose making use of all of the liberties and licenses of a novelist to tell you the story of the 2 days that preceded my coming here. How, bowed down by the weight of the subject which you have laid upon my shoulders, I pondered it, and made it work in and out of my daily life. I need not say that what I am about to describe has no existence. Oxbridge is an invention. So is Fernham. I is only a convenient term for somebody who has no real being. That's the existential crisis that we need right now. Cool, Virginia. I is a convenient way of saying that we don't exist. Lies will flow from my lips, but there may be perhaps some truth mixed up with them. It is for you to speak out this truth and to decide whether any part of it is worth keeping. If not, you will of course throw the whole thing into the waste paper basket and forget about it. Also, don't laugh at me if I pronounce famous authors' names wrong. I just don't know them. Okay, that's the end of it. Whatever. Here then was I, call me Mary Betton, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, or by any name you please. It does not matter, it is of no importance. Sitting on the bank of a river a week or two ago in fine October weather, lost in thought. That collar I've spoken of, women and fiction, the need of coming to some conclusion on a subject that raises all sorts of prejudices and passions, bowed my head to the ground. To right and left bushes of some sort, golden and crimson, glowing with colour, even it seemed burnt with the heat of fire. On the further bank the willows wept in perpetual lamentation, their hair about their shoulders. The rivers reflected whatever it chose of sky and bridge and burning tree, and when the undergraduate had oared his boat through the reflections, they closed again, completely, as if he had never been. There one might have sat the clock round, lost in thought. Thought, to call it by a prouder name than it deserved, had let its line down into the stream. It swayed, minute after minute, hither and thither among the reflections and the weeds, letting the water lift it and sink it until, you know the little tug, the sudden conglomeration of an idea at the end of one's line. I just love that imagery, like literally fishing for ideas. And then the cautious hauling of it in, the careful laying out of it. Alas, laid on the grass, how small, how insignificant this thought of mine, the sort of fish that a good fisherman puts back in the water so that it may grow fatter and be one day worth cooking and eating. I will not trouble you with that thought now, though if you look carefully you might find it for yourselves in the course of what I am going to say. However small it was, it had, nevertheless, the mysterious properties of its kind. Put back into the mind, it became at once very exciting and important, and it darted and sank and flashed hither and thither, set up such a wash and tumult of ideas that it was impossible to sit still. It was thus that I found myself walking with extreme rapidity across a glass plot. Instantly a man's figure rose to intercept me. Nor did I, at first, understand the gesticulations of a curious-looking object, in a cutaway coat and evening shirt, were aimed at me. His face expressed horror and indignation. Instinct rather than reason came to my help. He was a beadle. I was a woman. This was the turf. There was the path. Only the fellows and scholars are allowed there. The gravel is the place for me. Such thoughts were the work of a moment. As I regained the path, the arms of the beadle sank, his face assumed its usual repose, and though turf is better walking than gravel, no very great harm was done. The only change I could bring against the fellow and scholars of what the college might happen to be was that, in protection of their turf, which had been rolled 300 years in succession, they had sent my little fish into hiding. What idea had it been that it had sent me so audaciously trespassing, I can't now remember. The spirit of peace descended like a cloud from heaven, for the spirit of peace dwells anywhere. It is in the courts and the quadrilles of Oxbridge on a fine October morning. Strolling through those colleges, past those ancient halls, the roughness of present seemed smoothed away. The body seemed contained in a miraculous glass cabinet through which no sound could penetrate, and the mind, freed from any contract with facts, unless one trespassed on the turf again, was at liberty to settle down upon whatever meditation it was in harmony with in that moment. As chance would have it, some stray memory of an old essay about revisiting Oxbridge in the long vacation brought Charles Lamb to mind. St. Charles, said Thackeray, putting a letter to Lamb in his forehead. Indeed, among all the dead, I give you my thoughts as they came to me, Lamb is one of the most congenial, one to whom one would have liked to say, "Tell me then how you wrote essays," for his essays are superior to even Max Beermont, I thought, with all their perfection, because of that wild flash of imagination, that lightning crack of genius in the middle of them that leaves them flawed and imperfect, but starred with poetry. Lamb then came to Oxbridge, perhaps 100 years ago. Certain, he wrote an essay, the name escapes me, about the manuscript of one of Milton's poems which he saw there. It was Lycidas, perhaps, and Lamb wrote how it shocked him to think that possible any word in Lycidas could have been different from what it was. To think of Milton changing the words in that poem seemed to him a sort of sacrilege. This led me to remember what I could of Lycidius. I don't even know. I think there's a point with these classics as well, is that sometimes you don't know the references that they're making, and that's okay, and you can still get a lot of meaning out of it, and you don't need to feel small every time you come across a bit that you don't get, because if you really care about it, you can look it up later, and if they're a really good writer, you'll get it anyway. Notes in the margins that you didn't want from Leena. Then it led me to remember what I could of Lycidas, and to assume myself with guessing which word it could have been that Milton altered and why. Then it occurred to me that the very manuscript itself which Lamb had looked at was only a few hundred yards away, so that one could follow Lamb's footsteps across the quadrille to the famous library where the treasure is kept. Moreover, I recollected, as I put this plan into execution, it was the famous library that the manuscript of Thackeray's Esmond is also preserved. The critics often said that Esmond is Thackeray's most perfect novel, but the affection of their style, with its imitation of the 18th century, hampers one so far as I can remember. Unless the 18th century style was natural to Thackeray, a fact that one might prove by looking at the manuscript and seeing whether the alterations were for the benefit of the style or the sense. But then one would have to decide what is style and what is meaning, a question which, but here I am actually at the door which leads to the library itself. I must have opened it, for instantly there issued, like a guardian angel barring my way, with a flutter of a black gown instead of white wigs, a deprecating, silvery, kindly gentleman, who regretted in a low voice as he waved me back that ladies are only permitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction. That a famous library had been cursed by a woman is a fact of complete indifference to a famous library. Venerable and calm, with all its treasures safe locked within its breast, it seemed complacency and will, so far as I am concerned, so sleep for ever. Never will I wake those echoes, never will I ask for that hospitality again, I vowed as I descended the steps in anger. Still an hour remained before luncheon, and what was one to do? Stroll on the meadows, sit by the river? Certainly it was a lovely autumn morning, the leaves were fluttering to red on the ground. There was no great hardship in doing either, but the sound of music reached my ear. Some service or celebration was going forward. The organ played magnificently as I passed the chapel door. Just in case people haven't been following, what has just happened is that Virginia was sitting on the grass in the grounds of a very prestigious university. She was about to have a profound thought, and then a man walked past her and shooed her off the grass because only men are allowed to stand on the grass or sit on the grass. She had to stay to the gravel, so she lost her train of thought. Then she was thinking about Milton, and she realised that there was an original manuscript in the library nearby that she could go and look at to find out more about what she was pondering about that. And she went to the library door, and she was ushered away because women are not allowed in the library unless accompanied by a man, which is still the case in some private clubs in London. You can join the club if you're a sister or a wife of a man, but even if you are a paying member of the club, you're not allowed in the library, which is an experience I have had. Not that I was a member of the club, but I was just like visiting, and they were like, not in here. It's quite long, isn't it? We'll persevere. I'm finding this really relaxing. I hope everybody else is finding it in some way peaceful. So yeah, she's just been turned away from the door of the library, and she's feeling very indignant, and she's just hearing some organ music coming from far away. So that's where we are. I often need these kind of pointers when it comes to classics. I'm like, so what? There were some nice words, but what actually happened? So that's what happened. The organ played magnificently as I passed the chapel door. Even the sorrow of Christianity sounded in that serene air more like the recollections of sorrow than sorrow itself. Even the groaning of the ancient organ seemed lapped in peace. I had no wish to enter had I the right, and this time the verger might have stopped me, demanding my baptismal certificate or a letter of introduction from the dean. But those outside of those magnificent buildings is often as beautiful as the inside. Moreover, it was assumed enough to watch the congregation assembling, coming in and going out, busying themselves at the door of the chapel like bees at the mouth of a hive. Many were in cap and gown, some had tufts of fur on their shoulders, others were wheeled in bath chairs, others, though not past middle age, seemed creased and crushed into shapes so singular that one was reminded of those giant crabs and crayfish who heave with difficulty across the sands of an aquarium. As I leant against the wall, the university indeed seemed a sanctuary in which are preserved rare types which should soon be obsolete if left to fight for existence on the pavements of the Strand. Old stories of old deans and old doons came back to mind, but before I had summed up the courage to whistle, it used to be said that at the sound of a whistle, that fucking banging, I swear. It sounds like they're doing ballet in slow motion. Anyway. It used to be said that at the sound of a whistle, old Professor instantly broke into a gallop. The venerable congregation had gone inside. The outside of the chapel remained. As you know, its high domes and pinnacles can be seen like a sailing ship, always voyaging and never arriving, lit up at night and visible for miles, far away across the hills. I absolutely love, that's one of my favourite descriptions in this whole essay, is this idea of a chapel being a ship that never arrives anywhere, and it's this pinnacle of like discovery, but it's actually static and it doesn't, it's just always voyaging and never arriving. Was going to make a dick joke, but not gonna. I'm sure Virginia, if Virginia was here, she'd know the joke I was going to make. She'd probably make it first. Anyway, always voyaging and never arriving. Once, presumably, this quadrille, with its smooth lawns, its massive buildings, and the chapel itself was marsh too, where the grasses waved and the swine rottled. Teams of horses and oxen, I thought, must have hauled the stone in wagons from far countries, and then with infinite labour the grey blocks in whose shade I was now standing were poisoned in order for one on top of the other. Then the painters brought their glass for the windows. The masons were busy for centuries up there on the roof with putty and cement, spade and trowel. Every Saturday somebody must have poured gold out over the leathern purse into their ancient fists, for they had their beer and skittles, presumably of an evening. And an ending stream of gold and silver, I thought, must have flowed into this court perpetually to keep the stones coming and the masons working, to level, to ditch, to dig, and to drain. But it was then that the age of faith and money was poured liberally to set those stones on a deep fountain, and when the stones were raised, still more money was poured into it from the coffers of kings and queens and great nobles, to ensure that hymns should be sung here and scholars taught. Lands were granted, tithes were paid, and when the age of faith was over and the age of reason had come, still the same flow of gold and silver went on. Fellowships were founded, lectureships endowed. Only the gold and silver flowed now, not from the coffers of the king, but from the chests of merchants and manufacturers, from purses of men who had made, say, a fortune from industry, and returned in their wills a bounteous share of it to endow more chairs, more lectureships, more fellowships in the university where they had learnt their craft. Hence the libraries and the laboratories, the observatories, the splendid equipment of costly delicates, instruments which now stand on glass shelves, where centuries ago the grasses waved and the swine rottled. Certainly, as I strolled around the court, the fountains of gold and silver seemed deep enough, the pavements laid solidly over the wild grasses. Men with their trays on their heads went busily from staircase to staircase. Gaudy blossoms flowered in window boxes. The strains of gramophones blared out from the rooms within. It was impossible not to reflect. The reflection, whatever it may have been, was cut short. The clock struck. It was time to find one's way to luncheon. It's a curious fact that novelists have a way of making us believe that luncheon parties are invariably memorable for something very witty that someone once said, or for something very wise that was done. But they seldom spare a word for what was eaten. It was part of the novelist's convention not to mention soup and salmon and ducklings, as if soup and salmon and ducklings were of no importance whatsoever, as if nobody ever smoked a cigar or drank a glass of wine. Here, however, I shall take the liberty of defying that convention to tell you that the lunch on the occasion began with soles sunk in a deep dish, over which the college cook had spread a counterpane of the whitest cream, save it was branded here and there with brown spots like the spots on the flanks of a doe. After that came the partridges, and if this suggested a couple of bold brown birds on a plate, you are mistaken. The partridges, many and various, came with all their retinue of sauces and salads, the sharp and the sweet, each in its order, their potatoes, thin as coins, but not so hard, their sprouts, volletated as rosebuds, but more succulent. And no sooner had the roast been done with that silent serving man, the beadle himself, perhaps in a milder manifestation, set before us, wreathed in napkins, a confection which rose all sugar from the waves. To call it pudding and so relate it to ice and tapioca would be an insult. I just love the way she describes the food, that she's like, I know that novelists don't usually tell you what they're eating, but I find it very interesting, and I'm going to defy all convention by being very particular about what we ate and comparing sprouts to rosebuds. Meanwhile, the wine glasses had flushed yellow and flushed crimson. It had been emptied, it had been filled, and thus by the degrees was lit, halfway down the spine, which is the seat of the soul, not that hard little electric light which we call brilliance, as it pops in and out upon our lips, but the more profound, subtle, subterranean glow, which is the rich yellow flame of rational intercourse. No need to hurry, no need to sparkle, no need to be anybody but oneself. We are all going to heaven, and Vadyak is in the company. In other words, how good life seemed, how sweet its reward, how trivial its grudges or that grievance, how admirable friendship and the society of one's kind, as, lighting a good cigarette, one sunk among the cushions in the window seat. I think I'm going to leave that here for today. I find Virginia Woolf's writing very long-winded, but very hopeful and very warm and very witty in places. And I just find it like a great comfort. She feels like a very wise friend. So I hope you found that comforting as well if you're having a very panicky weekend or a very panicky life, depending on how much you read about climate change right now. But thank you so much for watching. This is bedtime book busking, because if you would like to contribute to the production of these videos, and if you just want to tip me and say thank you, you can join the Gumption Club. It is a Patreon only group. You can join for as little as $1. You get a free poetry collection and now a new free short story from me that is also in audio. When you sign up, you can get a MP3 of this reading that I've just done that I'll upload. So if you prefer listening to it in whatever way you want, you can have an MP3. You'll also be part of a secret Facebook group where we talk about social change and our lives and books and lots of other things. It's a really warm little community that we have in the Facebook group. So I'd love it if you wanted to join. Let me know in the comments how you feel about Virginia Woolf, if you've seen the new Vita and Virginia film and what you think of it. And I hope that brought you some calm and solace and potentially made you think about picking up a Virginia Woolf book if you'd felt intimidated by her before. Okay, I'm going to go. This has been lovely. I might come back and read the rest of it. Let me know in the comments if you'd like that. Or potentially I could read something else that's a classic. That would be quite cozy and nice. Let me know what you'd like me to read next, anyway, in the bedtime book busking series. And I will see you again soon. Frogs look out. Blue lipstick, don't mind if I do.